We'll turn to Musaf in just 1 second, but before we begin, I actually really like taking advantage of the small crowds that we have on day 2 on Sunday morning. It's good to be together, and it's good to be able to have a little bit of a discussion about Pesach. Last night, my niece, Sasha, asked 2 really great questions at the Passover table, and I think that we kind of humored her and tried to answer those questions, but I stayed up last night thinking about them, which is the wisdom and the theology that can only come from really wise children, right? That they ask important questions and beautiful questions. And I want to talk about those 2 questions because the first one I think is pretty relevant, and it also gives me a little insight into her mind about how she thinks of Pesach. And she asked, why is Pesach so sad? Which is the first question. And we first flippantly said, we're Jews, of course it's supposed to be sad, right? But then our answer as adults, we didn't validate her. We actually said, what are you talking about? It's so joyful, it's so happy. Look at us, we're here together, we're singing, we're with our family, everyone's drinking wine and reclining. It's joyful. Pesach is about joy. And we were right. And so was she. And I think that there's great insight into that, because if we're only focusing on the joy, on the freedom, the liberation, we're also missing out on a very important part of this story. And it's something that we've talked about here before, but it's also something that I think we can lose track of sometimes, not just in our day-to-day lives, but especially on Pesach, right? And that'll bring us to the second question in 1 second, but I just want to talk about this really quickly because Judaism thrives in the idea of dualism. And dualism in a way that's very unique to who we are as people. We always say in the Western world, in our Western mentality, our Western thought, things are not black and white. And in Judaism, of course they're not black and white. But Judaism asks us to do something very interesting. It allows us to say things are both black and white. Right? We teach shades of gray. In Judaism, we also talk and we teach that things can be black and things can be white. What are we supposed to be at the Passover Seder? Anyone? Slaves. What else are we supposed to be at the Passover Seder? Free people. Avadim hayinu, we were slaves. Ata b'nei chorin, but now we are free people. And yet at the end of the Seder, we say this year in Detroit, next year in Jerusalem, this year we are slaves, next year may we be free. The idea of the Pesach Seder is that somehow, without any paradox or without any seeming paradox, we uphold 2 ideals. We are slaves and we are free at the same time. We have to balance that. It's a powerful thing to think about, and it's a very difficult thing to think about because we want so badly in our Western minds to just clearly be one or the other. Here we are reclining to our left, drinking wine, singing and celebrating. What are you talking about, Sasha? We're so filled with joy. And yet, we're eating the bread of affliction. We're dipping our karpas in salt water to symbolize the tears of slavery. Everything we talk about is the story of ki'ilu, that we ourselves were supposed to have left Mitzrayim. And not left in the past tense, but leaving. We are slaves in Egypt. There's a great rabbi named Rabbi Simcha Bunim, who was a Hasidic Rebbe back in the 17th century, 18th century, who taught that every individual should, every day of their lives, wear 2 pockets in their clothes, and in one pocket should be the verse, "For me alone the world was created." And in the second pocket, "I am but dust and ashes." And to carry both of those, again, without any paradox, into our lives. And I've always thought that that's such a beautiful teaching of what Judaism is, but I think Sasha brought a new way of looking at it last night. Because according to Rabbi Simcha Bunim, we're supposed to uphold this idea of being created in the divine image on one hand, and on the other hand, having such humility that we lose our sense of ego and lose our sense of self. But what Sasha taught me last night is that on one hand we can be royalty, and we can be free, and we can be created in the divine image. And on the other hand, we can remember what it means to be slaves. Because if we're holding on to what it means to be slaves, then we know from Vayikra, we know from the book of Leviticus, that what we get from being in Mitzrayim, what we learn from being in Egypt, is to never treat people the way that we were treated. Love your neighbor, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and the Egyptians oppressed you. How do we hold on to Pesach? We are free. We are slaves. And as slaves, we are ethically charged to make sure that no one feels the same kind of suffering and the same kind of shame and embarrassment that we did. So that's her first question. And the second question, which I think is one that we all struggle with in that own way, is how do we do Pesach for these other 6 days? We have Seders for 2 nights, and then it's Pesach. Then it's a lot of matzah and cream cheese, right? And it's a good question. We have 2 nights of just incredible ritual and joy and enthusiasm and questions and deep theological discourse, and then we have 6 days of Hallel and matzah, and it's great. And then we end with Yom Tov, of course, but we don't have Seders on the last days of Yom Tov. So how do we do this for 6 more days? And I'm going to leave that question to you individually. And I'm going to wrestle with it too, because I think that it's an important one. And what I'd suggest is that somehow we return back to that first question too, that for these next 6 days of Pesach, when we're not having Sederim, when we're not sitting down for big festive meals that are filled with the different rites and rituals that we do for Passover, that we somehow lift up those ideas. And we make these 6 days both a reflection on who we are as slaves and what our ethical charge is because we are slaves, and also to keep that other note in our pocket. For me alone, the world was created. We are free. We should be filled with gratitude. We should be filled with joy, but we should also be filled with an ethical charge of what it means to move forward. Hope everyone has a Zis Pesach, a beautiful, meaningful, a free and yet an enslaved Pesach at the same time. I hope that we can hold both of those ideals as we move forward. Chag Sameach. We'll continue now with Musa.